Thank you for that. Well, let's move on. And I have to say, over the last few days, I've been given some very, very good pointers by viewers of UK Column, looking at who is getting in amongst councils in order to reframe the policy agenda inside the council. This is one organisation. It's called UK 100, Powers in Place, the powers local authorities have. It's a network of ambitious local government leaders for cleaner, more powerful communities, end the wait, insulate UK's new social housing energy insulation provider. So this is all policy which you can track straight back to the UN. We're not going to do that today. We're simply going to have a look at this organisation. Here it reinforces again, it's a network of local leaders who pledge to lead a rapid transition to net zero with clean air in their communities ahead of the government's legal target. And these people getting in amongst local councils in particular. I just had a look at the board here. People can freeze the screen and look at these individuals. But you've got everybody from special advisors, bankers, it's the NatWest Bank involved, EU Climate Foundation, and then you've got communications, coaching and mentoring. The moment you see coaching and mentoring, this is to do with reframing. We won't forget Emma, because she's the representative of Energy UK, which is the representative body for the whole of the UK's energy industry. Now, I challenged this organisation a few days ago because I was interested in how they were funded. If you look at their website, it told you to go to Companies House to see the funding, but when you went to Companies House and read it, they didn't tell you, because it said during the year, up to 31st December 2022, they received 1.2 million, but it then just said a number of sources. So I've asked for clarification. But if that organisation is working, we'll say, at higher level in councils and the networks around councils, this organisation is working at much lower level. This is the Society for Local Council Clerks. So we're getting down the scale, but now what we're doing is getting in amongst the district councils, the town parish community system in order to get this globalist agenda in. And I was delighted to be given part of a presentation which has been given by this organisation. It's on the subject of carbon literacy. Help your council tackle the climate emergency. And I'm going to go through this really quickly so we can have a little bit of discussion on it. Here's the workshop, the pathway to distant delivery. This was online. People were not allowed to speak to each other. They could only listen. But there's the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. This is the Carbon Literacy Trust, which is in the background providing the meat of the material. If you freeze this, it says that it's a massive collaborative project and involves people and organisation from all sectors and walks of life. Now, what did they do? Well, the first thing they did is put the attendees on the Zoom meeting on the guilt trip. How could I look my grandchildren in the eye and say I knew what was happening to the world and did nothing? Very strict rules on what you could do during this video conferencing, and essentially each of the people participating were very much kept isolated, so they didn't really have a chance to speak to anybody else, including in the comfort breaks. And what were you aiming at? Well, of course, if you answered all the questions correctly, you could ultimately get a certificate saying that you were competent. I've met all the requirements of the carbon literacy standard, and thus, for the purposes of the workshop, education and community, should be regarded as carbon literate. So nobody's checking the background to the information they're putting across, but they are assessing people. And this is big business, and it needs to be watched very carefully because, of course, if we look at the numbers of people they're boasting about, over 53,000 citizens certified. Maybe that's a little bit of black humour there, but of course they've been reframed into this globalist agenda. These are some of the other slides that are being used. Why carbon literacy in our council is important: values, influence, duty, ethics, political and social will, government and sectoral targets, financial savings. But you've got to do it to be the best. And this is another one. It's giving people little flashes on what they should be thinking about. Have a look at the loft and wall insulation there and take into account Mike Robinson's warnings over the insulation, the energy efficiency of your house, and whether you can face a criminal charge as a result of not keeping ahead of the game on that. But there's flights, there's what we can eat, there's everything is being discussed as a guilt trip. We've got emotive stuff like this. Greece is on fire, no mention of arson. As far as they're concerned, this is all to do with global warming. We get in statistics, which helps the scientific nature, believe those scientists. But what's very clear here is that the top 1% earners are not only recognised, it's as though they're going to stay while people at the bottom of the pile are going to suffer clampdown in order to adhere to the new rules. And if we go on, funding. Now, what we learn is that if local councils get involved in this sort of training, suddenly pots of funding open up, which make their life easier to spread the word, but also to spend on other projects. So money is part of, I'll call it bribery with a small b, in order to get this agenda into the heart of local councils. This is the psychology. You're getting each individual taking place in the meeting to pick up one action that they can implement, pick an action that they can implement with colleagues, complete the action plan template. So this is reframing people in order to support the agenda without asking if it's right. And I'm going to add, woe betide anybody who doesn't agree, because in this presentation, they were very quick to point out that they're having trouble. This is the good news. They're having trouble convincing enough people quickly enough. And so what they did in the presentation is to highlight groups that they're concerned about. So here we have the backbone conservatives. They identify as traditional, practical, hardworking. Their concerns are countryside preservation. And if you're going to try and talk to them, you should frame your message to discuss climate change impacts on agriculture, seasonal produce, sustainable land management, and engage national leadership in successes. So this is really going for the political side. Here we've got what they call civic pragmatists. They're identified as charitable, practical, moderate, community-orientated and progressive. And of course, you see the cakes on the table. So I'll say gently, this is Blue Rinse Brigade. These are people probably involved in the church. They want to do good, but you need to get amongst them to make sure you convert them to the new zero agenda programme. Here's disengaged battlers. Maybe some of the UK column people come into this particular description. They identify as resilient, they feel unheard and unrepresentative, and their concerns are inequality, economic disparity, fairness, and social justice. They are a big problem, and they need to be dealt with in a special way to get the agenda across. And if I go on to the toolkit here, this is provided in order that anybody who's now picked up the agenda being pushed by SLCC is going to be pushed through as effectively as possible to as many people as possible. So on that, let's come back to you, David. I have to say, I was able to see a huge amount of material, and I talked to some really fascinating individuals who travelled from another part of the country in order to give a little briefing on what they saw happening. But this was political applied psychology. It was mind-blowing in its breadth and depth in order to capture local authorities down to the level of a parish council in order to get what is essentially a UN globalist net zero agenda across. What's your thoughts?
Well, I think of all the information you gave there, the most key was the point you made about dissent not being tolerated. You must comply. These issues are not being put forward for debate or justified based on the facts. They must be believed. They must be accepted. Otherwise, you're a heretic. There's a religious aspect to this. There's a pseudo-religious aspect to this. And you must believe the core tenets of the religion, or pretend to. Otherwise, you will be condemned to outer darkness in council terms, which means you'll be viewed as a troublemaker. Well, long live the troublemakers.
Long live the troublemakers. Thank you for that. The other thing that was pointed out to me is that local councils are now being offered professional clerks. So in a parish council, right there next to the community, usually the clerk is somebody who is competent, but they're brought in essentially as an amateur to help the parish council. But what's being offered to the parish councils is professional clerks. And if the council engages a professional clerk, that unleashes pots of funding, which of course is very attractive to most parish councils who are usually very short of money. So this is very cold, calculated stuff. And ultimately, we can see that this is a massive program of reframing, changing the mindset of people to go from their normal, happy lives into something which is controlled by a centralized UN climate change net zero agenda. And I'll just add that I've also been able to see now the very thing that Mike from Slough warned about, and that was the fact that if you followed through the C40 city agenda, it would actually bring you to the fact that we're not going to be able to eat meat. And I've now seen that document trail, and I will do my best to bring those to the perception of the UK column viewers in future news. Now, before we end the segment, if we can do it, I'd just like to bring in the video, if that's possible, showing where we are really headed if we allow this madness to continue. Let's see this video clip.
מדפסת תעשייתית שפיתחנו, שמיועדת להחליף משחטה. לשאלתך לפני כן, פה אנחנו טוענים את המדפסת הזו בתאי גזע, שאנחנו יודעים למעל לשריר ולשומן, והיא יודעת להדפיס טונות ביום. טונות? טונות של בשר מתורבת ביום. זה רק לשם ההמחשה, אתה תוכל לבחור את הסטייק שלך, והמדפסת תתחיל לשחרר סטייקים בקצב תעשייתי. סיריליון, אני לא יודע אם אתה אוהב יותר שומן או פחות שומן.
כך באמצע.
באמצע. view order, slide to print, ופה בעצם המדפסת מתחילה לייצר סטייקים. סטייקים, הייחודיות פה היא שתאי הגזע נשארים חיים אחרי שהם מודפסים. סטייק יהיה מוכן בסביב הדקה. דקה. השלב פה הוא שווה ערך לשלב שבו הפרה נולדת בעצם. הפרה לוקח 2 עד שהיא נשחטת, היא מזהמת את העולם בתהליך. פה זה תהליך שהוא הרבה יותר קצר.
בלי שטח, בלי מים ובלי
בלי שטח, בלי מים, בלי חתימה פחמנית. בלי פלטות ובלי כלום.
איפה הסטייק?
הסטייק עכשיו מודפס, ועכשיו אנחנו נעבור
Well, there you have it. I'm sorry, I should have said that, of course, the emphasis of the video was on screen, but essentially that was Netanyahu looking at a 3D printer of meat. And what was happening was the machine was printing off a steak where you could select the amount of fat in the meat to make it the steak you wanted. This was capable of producing tons of 3D printed meat. Mark, very quickly as a last comment, how do you fancy one of those steaks?
Well, I'll pass until I learn more about it. It's fascinating that it can be done at all. But they're talking about how cows pollute the world. It's all based on that. And I'd like them to show me concretely how cows measure up in so-called polluting the world, and always on this assumption that carbon dioxide, one of the gases of life, is essentially potentially poisonous or a pollutant. It's simply not true. Carbon dioxide is only 0.04% of the atmosphere. Let me get that right. And even pro-climate organizations will admit that. The only other thing I'll add is local governments should be constituted for gathering public input and sending it up the ladder to Parliament, not dictating what the public should believe.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much on that. Well, if that's madness in one direction, you got some interesting progress in another.